Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Clean Energy for Biden's third and final policy summit. Tonight's topic is innovation, a common theme throughout CE4B's policy papers, and one I know personally well from my time in the DOE Loan Program Office during the Obama administration. I am Nidhi Thacker, a national co-chair of CE4B, and I will be your MC for the evening. For those of you not familiar with Clean Energy for Biden or CE4B, CE4B is a network of clean economy business leaders and advocates who organized to elect Joe Biden as our 46th president. CE4B's almost 12,000 members raised over $3.2 million, conducted 160 phone banks, and developed almost 50 policy papers, among many other accomplishments. Thank you for joining us tonight for what will assuredly be another evening of insightful discussion. As many of us are aware, there is a continued need for increased funding for clean energy research to fuel the next wave of innovation that will help accelerate deployment and demonstration of clean energy technologies and further enhance US competitiveness. We chose innovation as tonight's theme since it fits squarely within President-elect Biden's plan for $400 billion in clean energy investment over the next 10 years. I am pleased to note that in addition to our distinguished panelists this evening, we will also have Congresswoman Haaland, Dr. Cheryl Martin, and Trenton Allen providing remarks tonight. Before we get started, I would like to turn it over to Zoe Elizabeth, a critical team member from the policy team. Zoe?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. As soon as we launched CE4B, members wanted to use their voice on clean energy policy, climate solutions, and environmental justice. So we organized the policy recommendations effort to capture our members' ideas and organize and curate them in a final guide that we have provided to the Biden transition team. 48 papers with about 175 recommendations are included on issues ranging from leveraging private capital and workforce development to climate justice and rural development. I'm grateful to everyone who contributed so much to make the time and effort a success. Each paper was drafted by a team of 3 or more volunteers, reviewed by a third-party expert, and then fact-checked and edited by a copy editing team led by Alice Coase, MC Hammond, and Francis Sawyer. A matrix tying each recommendation to the Biden climate plan was then developed by Reiko Rowe. Sam Pedretti, our resident graphic designer, compiled everything into a useful and beautiful document. And finally, none of it would have come together without my co-lead editors, Alec McDonough and Will Riker. So a big thank you to everyone who participated in this effort, and an additional thank you to Charlie Pilzer and Will Riker for moderating tonight's Zoom chat. So please, in the effort of continuing this ongoing dialogue, feel free to bring your questions and comment into the chat window. It's important to note before we begin that while CE4B facilitated the development of the recommendations in the policy guide, CE4B does not endorse or take a position on any of these recommendations. Each paper stands on its own and represents the views of its respective authors. Ideas and recommendations should be attributed only to the appropriate author and not to CE4B. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Nidhi.
Thanks so much, Zoe. An incredible amount of work, as you pointed out, went into all of these policy papers and this policy summit. Without further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker tonight, Dr. Cheryl Martin. Dr. Martin founded Harwich Partners to engage public and private sector entities in designing and implementing solutions for complex problems, especially those related to energy sustainability and technology adoption. Dr. Martin previously served as acting director of DOE's ARPA-E program during the Obama administration. In addition, she was deputy director for commercialization at DOE, where she led ARPA-E's Technology to Market program, which helps develop breakthrough energy technologies to succeed in the marketplace. Prior to her time at DOE, Cheryl was an executive in residence with Kleiner Perkins after a distinguished career with Rom and Haas Company in roles ranging from technology development to finance and business management. She also serves as the chair of the board of directors for Sound Agriculture, an early stage sustainable agriculture technology company, as well as sits on the boards for the Clean Energy Trust and Elemental Accelerator, and as well as CE4B's Executive Council. Dr. Martin has a PhD in organic chemistry from MIT. And with that introduction, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Martin.
Thanks so much, Nidhi. I am really excited to be here tonight for tonight's discussion on policies related to innovation. It is a subject near and dear to my heart. I think, though, like the earlier summit topics of infrastructure and equity, innovation can mean a lot of things. And I think as you listen to tonight's wide range of energy policy conversations during the panel discussions, you'll be able to really appreciate that. And it certainly ran through the threads of the first 2 days. But for me, successful innovation can really be summed up in the motto that we use for RPE's Tech to Market efforts. If it works, will it matter? And today, more than ever, with the critical challenges facing the world due to climate change and the economic crisis that continues to be exacerbated by the pandemic, it's important that we focus on getting things done that really matter in this important area. And so for some of us, that means scale. And it doesn't just mean deployment of technologies like solar and wind and lithium-ion batteries that have come down cost curves much faster and deeper than envisioned just a few years ago, right? We have to do that. We have to actually look at where there are more enabling federal and state policies that need to be implemented to help us scale what we have today. But we also have to look at innovation, not just for the development of new ideas, because sometimes when we talk innovation, I think we kind of get it conflated with invention. And it's like, yes, we need invention, but we need innovation. We need people to be thinking about how do we get those innovative new ideas into demonstrable, scalable products? How do we get things across that first valley of death? How do we get things not stuck in the demonstration phase and get them moving forward and into things that people are willing to scale, either through first funding opportunities like our green banks or our own loan program at DOE, into the private sector where more and more funds are continuing to come into the space. And I think from a finance perspective, we're looking at innovation happening there as well, as people are coming in from the private sector, from philanthropy, and the corporate sector, the non-banking sector, to really bring more and more capital into the sector, which is exactly what we need. And I think a final piece about innovation today, when we think about what it is and who it is, innovation today must mean creating solutions that address the challenges faced by all our communities, all people, not just the first adopters of technologies or in our most affluent communities. And so when we think of the business models that we need to scale, how are we going to be more encompassing in our thinking, more broad in how we think about our end partner? And I think the way we do this is to think about innovation in how we partner, with whom we partner, and in how we identify and address the inevitable risks that are going to be faced in development. And so innovation today requires not only the policies that you're going to be hear about tonight, and I think we'd be doing a disservice if we thought about it just as policies that are over there. But it really needs people from all functions, from the public and the private and the nonprofit sectors, more than ever engaged in focusing on outcome. And so I'd ask each of you, as you listen to these policy ideas and the conversations that'll be happening among the panelists in these 3 panels tonight, to think about, well, what could you bring to this conversation? What can you do to help advance these ideas? I'm excited to hear more tonight and hopefully partner with some of you as we all work together to make clean energy really matter. And so with those short comments, I'd like to actually introduce the next speaker, Congresswoman Deb Haaland. Congresswoman Haaland is a 35th generation New Mexican and grew up in a military family. Through hard work and determination, she earned degrees from the University of Mexico and the University of Mexico Law School. For several years, she ran her own small business and later became the first chairwoman elected to the Laguna Development Corporation Board of Directors, overseeing business operations of the 2nd largest tribal gaming enterprise in New Mexico. She successfully advocated for the Laguna Development Corporation to create policies and commitments to earth-friendly business practices. After a lifetime of organizing communities to stand up for New Mexico families, Congresswoman Haaland was elected as one of the first Native American women to serve in Congress. She has been a huge supporter of clean energy and is a champion for how Indigenous communities are leading the charge against the climate crisis. And so with that very brief intro, Congresswoman, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. They said the phrase for 2020 is unmute yourself. So I can see how that, no matter how much I say that's not going to happen, it happens. So, but thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and really happy to be invited today. And thank all of you for all the hard work everyone did to get Joe Biden and Kamala Harris elected as our next president and vice president. I joined many clean energy and climate focused phone banks and conversations and worked to ensure that our voters showed up, and I'm so happy that they did. The policy proposals you all have developed will help the Biden administration to hit the ground running once they're sworn into office, and I can't wait until that day comes. I served on the 2020 Platform Drafting Committee, where we worked to build the most ambitious climate platform ever, with focus on clean energy innovation and deployment. Then, as a member of the Biden-Harris Climate Engagement Advisory Council, I got to see up close that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris know there is no greater challenge facing our country and the world than climate change, and that they are committed to transition to a clean energy economy in a way that creates jobs and addresses economic, racial, and environmental injustice. Making that transition is going to take a combination of political leadership and will, the right policies and economic incentives, and innovation. Fortunately, we elected President Biden, a climate pioneer, and Vice President Harris, a longtime champion of environmental justice, who are committed to turning this challenge into an opportunity to revitalize our economy and address the inequities in our system. Their plans for clean energy, climate, infrastructure, and environmental justice will make historic investments in research and innovation, which is something that I've been working to get a head start on in Congress. Earlier this fall, the House passed my amendment to the Clean Economy, Jobs, and Innovation Act to increase funding for the Department of Energy's research accounts. During tonight's second panel, Varun Sivaram will talk more about boosting research funding, and Nicholas Eisenberger will discuss how the investment in carbon capture R&D that the president-elect has proposed will pay off, and that's during the third panel. Another area of research focuses that will help promote equity is decarbonizing the agriculture sector. I worked with Senator Cory Booker on the Climate Stewardship Act to provide incentives for farmers to adopt climate-friendly practices, which will help engage rural Americans in the fight against climate change. For those efforts to be successful, we need more research into soil management, plant biology, and agricultural techniques to remove carbon dioxide from the air and store it in the ground. The Biden-Harris plan proposes to invest in this, and Genevieve Nowicki's presentation during the first panel should give us all a better idea of what the details might look like. Finally, it's remarkable that the Biden-Harris plan targets 40% of the federal investment in a clean energy revolution to disadvantaged communities and empowers those communities and the people who live there to benefit from the clean energy revolution. This was probably covered more during last week's summit, but I want to mention it because it's so important and because it speaks to who Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are. During the listening session, Climate Engagement Advisory Council, during the listening sessions that we held, we heard from tribal communities that don't have reliable electricity or the clean water that they need to prevent the spread of COVID, and that bear the burden of years of coal and uranium mining. And I know this because Laguna, Pueblo, where I'm from, was home to the largest open pit uranium mine in the world for 30 years. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris really listened to stories like the mini one I just told you. And they crafted their plan to have an impact on real people because they're focused on serving the public. Their commitment to direct resources to disadvantaged communities will help develop the distributed energy technologies that can bring power and water to remote Native American communities and fundamentally change the lives of people who live in those communities. And it will deliver them using local workers, created good paying jobs, and training workers along the way. That is the kind of change that our country is going to see under the leadership of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, powered by the innovation that you all have worked on. Thank you so much again for having me and for everything you have done and everything you will do for our country. And I'm so grateful again to be here, and I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Haaland, for being here with us tonight, for your inspirational remarks, and for your constant leadership on clean energy, and for reminding us how innovation can provide a pathway for economic and environmental injustice. There really is a bright future ahead of us if we further continue to embrace innovation to accelerate its deployment. Also, Dr. Martin, thank you for mentioning this motto: if it works, will it matter? It's really a lot of food for thought, and for making the connection between critical private sector capital needed to better leverage public dollars, and for providing all of us a call to action to enhance innovation. I would like to go ahead and kick off our panels this evening. Again, thank you, Congresswoman Haaland and Dr. Martin, for your opening remarks. We're really pleased you could be with us tonight. Our first panel tonight will feature a discussion on innovative fuels and rural energy. Our panel will be moderated by Adam Siegel, and Adam will introduce our panelists, but I would also like to kick off the panel by providing a brief bio for Adam. Adam Siegel has long focused on helping foster energy smart perspectives and practices within the Department of Defense. At Insight Through Analysis, Adam helps innovators leap the innovator's valley of death. And with that, Adam, I would like to turn it over to you.
Good evening. I do appreciate Cheryl Martin's reminding us all of RPE's, in essence, motto, which I already had modified for this panel, because if we can execute the 5 concepts proposed in this panel, the 5 speakers will get to, if they work, if we can execute them, they will matter. They will matter for change. We have 5 speakers this evening. Solomon Goldstein Rose will be speaking on hydrogen and ammonia production. Annie Petsonk will be on flight aviation fuels. Dan Sanchez will be providing a perspective on how we can look to innovative forest products and bioenergy to help clean up the forests, to do the appropriate sweeping up, to quote the soon-to-be former president. And and Genevieve Nowicki will be looking at regenerative agriculture, and Jill Kaufman-Johnson will be looking at how we can leverage algae for biofuels and biomaterials. Before we get to the panel and Ashley speaking, we have a short videos from each of the panelists to discuss their issues. Charlie?
Hi, I'm Solomon. Clean hydrogen and hydrogen carriers such as ammonia are essential for decarbonizing fertilizer, steel production, and other industrial processes.
So it looks like we have
creating
a
emissions-free
little bit of
fuels
trouble
for
with
ships,
the
airplanes, and more.
audio.
Producing hydrogen from water
If you
using
don't
clean
mind
electricity can create a way to
bearing
profitably
with
build
us.
more renewable generation in undertapped Great Plains states and export it around the world. To
Oh, it
maximize the
looks like the audio
potential
is
for
working.
U.S. hydrogen industry, Congress should provide tax credits to drive a rapid scale-up in electrolyzer manufacturing and lower the costs of clean hydrogen production. We also need federal leadership to coordinate infrastructure planning and to create early markets for hydrogen products through federal agency and military purchasing, demonstration projects, and more. With federal coordination, infrastructure can be equitably sited and new jobs can be targeted to benefit communities that have historically suffered from racist siting of dirty factories and power plants. Those new jobs are estimated to exceed 3 million by 2050, replacing fossil fuel employment 3 times over.
Hi, I'm Annie Petsonk. Our 5-point plan for putting aviation on the flight path to carbon neutrality can put people to work building cleaner aircraft, retrofitting today's aircraft to use new low and zero carbon fuels, and put people to work growing and generating those fuels. Any new bailout money for airlines should be conditioned on these 5 points. First, a cap on the emissions of the aviation sector through legislation or regulation. Second, renewed diplomacy to be sure that other major aviation nations meet these same caps. Third, accelerating the development and deployment of sustainable aviation fuels. Fourth, standards to improve the emissions performance of engines. EPA has the tools to do this through the Clean Air Act. And finally, research and development to bring this all together and help build the new aircraft of the future. Thank you.
Hi there, this is Daniel Sanchez from the University of California, Berkeley. Western forests in the United States face escalating risks from catastrophic wildfire, along with loss of secure carbon sinks, as well as life and property. We envision a world where new and innovative wood products and forest products, including bioenergy, biofuels, and mass timber, enable the cost-effective restoration of Western forests, thereby reducing catastrophic climate impacts on frontline communities from wildfire risk. We envision using federal procurement of biopower and mass timber through the Federal Power Authority's General Services Administration and Defense Logistics Agency, continued enhancements to budgeting and collaborative authorities at the U.S. Forest Service, alongside an increase in research and development funding, deployment grants, and loan programs, both at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Energy.
Hello, I want to introduce you to the amazing team that worked on the regenerative agriculture paper.
Regenerative agriculture is key to Biden's plan of decarbonizing the food and agriculture sector and leveraging our agriculture to remove carbon dioxide and reduce nitrogen pollution.
Regenerative agriculture practices include using cover crops, reducing tillage, rotating crops, spreading compost, or using intensive grazing.
While regenerative farmers save money, farmers still need incentives and help with adoption. Our recommendations are to reform federal crop insurance to encourage the building of soil health, offer preferential loans for producers demonstrating risk mitigation through improved soil health outcomes.
Increase funding for the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, including the Soil Health Division. Establish an outcomes-verified soil health program.
Help increase the market for cover crop products. Increase funding for conservation title working lands programs. And importantly, recognize indigenous conservation practices.
Hello. The Biden Energy Plan states that the U.S. must reduce emissions on global shipping and aviation and double down on the liquid fuels of the future.
Despite breakthroughs in electric battery technology for passenger vehicles, long-haul trucks, heavy machinery, marine transportation, and aviation still rely primarily on fossil fuels, and replacement turnover can take decades. Algae-derived products can create fuels and other goods that are tunable to a wide variety of applications, including drop-in fuels such as biodiesel and jet fuel, as well as plastics, fertilizers, and other co-products, while substantially improving the emissions footprint. Our recommendations are:
create an algae incentive program, AIP, similar to the California Solar Initiatives, to use the economies of scale to bring down prices. Increase 45Q carbon capture and storage, CCS tax credit. Incentivize federal procurement in bio-based products and access the USDA loan, business and industry loan guarantee program. Thank you so much.
So I hope you appreciated those videos. And in your chat, by the way, real quick reminder, the biography, brief bios should be there for each of our speakers. But now, after we've heard from the speakers a brief overview of their papers, I'd like to start asking some questions, get a little bit of a conversation going. You know, one of the ways we could summarize how CE4B Clean Energy's for Biden's priorities for energy in these policy papers is as E3, economy, environment, and equity. Can you briefly, and starting with Genevieve, could you briefly lay out how your proposal boosts the economy while reducing environmental challenges and addressing environmental and economic inequities and injustices?
Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you so much for being here and able to address such an important issue as regenerative agriculture. The primary mechanism for the economy is regenerative agriculture at its core is a cost-saving mechanism. Farmers don't have to spend as much money on what they call inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and other aspects by successfully managing their land. through these new techniques, these actually very old techniques. And by moving this, it ends up that farmers can save their farm. There's not as many bankruptcies, and it ends up being a rural development at its core on the economy. And moving on to the environment. As we know, nitrogen is a huge pollutant. We also, what a lot of people know is that it takes up 1 to 2% of the overall energy use for fossil energy. This leads to dead zone, having the pollution leads to dead zones, runoffs, and all these other factors. By reducing our total input in these through regenerative agriculture, we'll be saving the environment from a lot of these pollutions. And then finally, on dealing with inequity. Unfortunately, underserved communities are the people that are hit hardest by the runoff and the other pollution, leading to blue baby syndrome and all sorts of other environmental harm that will be reduced when we move over to regenerative agriculture. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you, Genevieve. I'd like to stay with what we might consider rural areas. Dan, do you have some, how would you address that question?
Sure, absolutely. I think that forests in the Western United States kind of sit at the intersection of both climate change impacts, but also climate change opportunities. We're seeing the increase of catastrophic wildfire, including in areas that are populated, where people are living across the Western United States. And this is actually a very large source of CO2 emissions. The estimates for this year were about 90 million tons of CO2 from the wildfires on 4 million acres in California. That's larger than the electricity sector in the state of California. So, the carbon storage, but also the carbon releases that come from Western forests and Western forest fires, it provides kind of the environmental impetus for this. But I think, on the equity side, there's a real opportunity, not only for wood utilization and development of new innovative wood products, whether they be biomass or other kind of innovative forest products, but also to reduce catastrophic wildfire risk, which will decrease losses to loss and property related to catastrophic wildfire in the West. I think that California and Western United States is rapidly emerging as one of the first places we're seeing the catastrophic impacts of climate change through these severe wildfires. And so there's an opportunity, again, for growth, for emissions benefits, and for climate change risk reduction by tackling this opportunity.
Doing a quick step back, one of the things we can look at all 5 of these papers, each in their own ways, are truly most multifaceted in creating opportunities while addressing challenges. And while I want to shift into this is rural agriculture, economy, energy, and fuels, in many ways we could say algae sort of is bridging of that space. It's an agricultural process to, in no small part, produce fuels. Jill, do you want to try to address the question?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here and being able to bring in algae. And it turns out that algae R&D over the past 20 years in biofuel and biomaterials has actually made invaluable technology advances that have gone beyond clean energy to impact dozens of other markets. So leveraging the US's current leadership in algae R&D and production through expanding incentives and investments will help accelerate growth in the whole algae industry. And this will have significant economic and environmental benefits if we can accelerate commercialization of more products, many of which already are making impacts in food, animal and aquaculture feed, wastewater treatment, and fertilizer soil amendments for more sustainable agriculture. But the thing about growing algae is a lot of the production in the US is in rural economies, and it will boost rural economies and expand carbon capture opportunities. So some of these operations in these rural communities range from large algae farms in rural Texas and New Mexico to seaweed cultivation in coastal areas, employing fisher people in the off-season. And jobs range from operators and engineers and scientists to accounting and trades and logistics. But also we're finding through the Algae Foundation that the algae industry already is supporting a robust program of workforce development at community colleges. So this includes on-the-job training that's happening and internship programs that we're preparing for workforce with transferable skill sets to industries such as wastewater treatment and sustainable agriculture.
So moving slightly different, but also it has a lot of impact into the agricultural world from a different angle. Solomon, do you want to talk about the hydrogen and ammonia productions and your concepts?
Yeah, clean hydrogen cuts across many sectors, which is part of why it's so useful. It makes the energy system more efficient as a whole. Clean hydrogen will decarbonize fertilizer, but can also be used as a fuel. Scaling up hydrogen production would boost the economy across manufacturing, especially manufacturing hydrogen electrolyzers, renewable electricity to power the hydrogen production, construction and operation of the production and distribution infrastructure, and clean hydrogen would eliminate emissions from current fossil fuel, hydrogen and ammonia production. And then hydrogen can decarbonize steel making and other industrial processes, and can decarbonize shipping and other transportation. And this means that pollution can be eliminated in communities that have suffered from environmental injustice while growing more jobs for those communities and for fossil fuel workers, some of whom will need to transition to new jobs.
So I look at the possibility of the hydrogen, I look at algae biofuel, and I start to question aviation. Do we solve the airplane? And we come to Annie, and I'm looking for your thoughts as to the question we asked about E3.
Capping and cutting aviation's global warming pollution, as well as its local air pollution, can help tackle global warming and improve the environment of local communities who live around airports. If you've ever sat on a plane while it's on the ground and it's refueling and you've smelled that stinky smell of the kerosene going onto the plane, you know that that stuff is not good for the lungs of people who are breathing those fumes. So health benefits, environmental benefits, and job benefits, both from building the low carbon and zero carbon emitting aircraft of the future and retrofitting today's aircraft so that they can use cleaner burning alternative fuels, including some of the fuels, the biofuels, algae fuels that have been discussed here. Aircraft of the future potentially flying on hydrogen, some potentially electrifying. Those jobs in an industry that's been hit hard by COVID can be saved and rebuilt as long as the industry puts climate at the core of its recovery from COVID. Thanks.
So one of the things that I take from Jill's comments, and we can think about, Annie's comments, and we can think about the cross sector of all these, is each of these has impacts from the local to the global. The local pollution of kerosene, but the global climate impacts, wildfires, fires in the lungs, and smoky, beautiful sunsets in Washington, D.C., and cooling and otherwise. Across all five of them, this is true. But I'd like to switch to different. This is an evening of innovation. We had heard from somebody who led one of the key government institutions for helping leap the innovators of Valley of Death. It's something that I try to focus on. So I'd be interested, because I think each of you have different challenges perhaps for advancing. So what do you, when we consider the innovators Valley of Death, what do you see as a key challenge for why your focus area isn't necessarily advancing, and what might be solutions to that challenge? When I play around a little bit with this, is Solomon, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So one key challenge, natural gas, methane, is so cheap in the US right now. And so it's a very hard bar to compete with, which means it doesn't attract investment to move hydrogen from a proven technology to full-scale commercialization. Right now, it's easier simply to produce hydrogen from natural gas. And so to scale up in the very near future, we need policy to guarantee a market for clean hydrogen through mandates, subsidies, or government purchasing to attract the investment and get clean hydrogen to that full-scale commercialization. That's how you get that over the Valley of Death, is guarantee a market in the case of clean hydrogen and mass production of electrolyzers.
So trying to perhaps smoothly move into another one. Jill, is that sounds like that's very similar to the
Yeah,
challenges you
I
see.
would agree with Solomon. I think those are some of the issues, but I think the other thing to think about is sort of many of the products, biofuel and other products made from algae, are competing with production systems that have been optimized, scaled, and subsidized over the past 100 years, right? From fuel production to food systems. And so the biggest challenge is, like Solomon said, is securing investment so we can build larger plants, so we can advance research for, in our case, more productive and resilient algae strains, and bring down the cost of production, coming down that cost curve like so many of the other clean energy solutions have done, so that those products can then compete with the fossil-based incumbents. So it's a lot of the same issues, but thinking more broadly about the system we're all trying to work to change.
So Genevieve, in some ways, the established market isn't the challenge for regenerative, but perhaps it's established something else. How would you think is your Valley of Death challenge?
I think it's primarily a cultural one. I think it's something that farmers have been doing things a certain way for a very long time now. There's a whole infrastructure at USDA that is, tunneling them towards that, whether it's the crop insurance program, how their loans are structured. Everything is gearing towards doing a certain mechanism that's been well established of using certain inputs at a certain scale. And they're very farmers are struggling these days. There's, bankruptcies are still as high as they ever have been. And, risk averse, understandably so, that say, hey, this is this great new thing. But unless there's the federal support behind it, that is going to assure farmers that, yes, this is a good thing, but we're going to have your back just in case you do have any problems or there is some sort of catastrophic event, then they're not going to be willing to move along, adopt it. And then there's a whole education process. People don't like change fundamentally. So if you want to work this forward, you have to basically have a whole education system that will bring the farmer along and make them feel secure in doing a new mechanism.
So Dan, what do you think the challenge is for, rather than burning the forests and smoking the skies, turning that into valuable product?
Sure. I think it makes sense to think about the two different kinds of innovative wood products and innovative forest products that we're envisioning, and we envision in our white paper. One of those has to do with mass timber and other structural wood products that we can use to build tall wood buildings. In that case, it's a technology that's proven pretty well in Europe and in other industrialized countries, but it's not well adopted within the United States. And I think architects and engineers can learn a lot more about incorporating wood into their building. The other product that we're thinking about is really liquid and gaseous fuels production from biomass. This actually looks a lot like what Solomon was speaking about. Rather than proceeding through electrolysis, what we need to do is to gasify biomass at scale and turn it into a transportation fuel. It's a technology that's kind of just on the edge of commercialization. And in California, we actually have a statewide low carbon fuel standard, which is providing a tremendous amount of market support to pull those low carbon fuels, including hydrogen made from biomass, into the California transportation fuel market. I'll note that we don't have this on this panel, but there is another Clean Energy for Biden proposal around a national low carbon fuel standard. And I think a lot of really exciting synergies to scale up the California model to the entire United States.
So Annie, what do you see as the challenge, that core innovators valley of death to getting to a carbon-free aviation world?
The single most important step to get over that valley of death is a mandatory cap and declining cap on the emissions of aviation. That would provide the demand signal that aviation will need the fuels of the future that we're talking about here. And that, as the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard has demonstrated, will drive investment, durable investment into those fuels. We're also seeing, Adam, that big companies who before COVID bought 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 air tickets a year, those companies are now taking climate commitments. And part of their commitments are to reduce their scope 3 emissions, or the emissions from their corporate travel. So they are demanding that airlines start using these fuels as well. with international standards to make sure that the life cycle consequences of different fuels are carefully taken into account, we think that a cap on emissions and rigorous standards for emissions from aircraft engines can drive this market forward and get over that valley of death.
So before we turn over to the next panel, I thought I'd ask a quick lightning round question. Who do you see as champions and opponents for moving this forward? Who should we be tackling, blocking against, and who should we be enabling to make this happen? Genevieve, have some thoughts?
I don't want to say particular names per se, but I think it's going to be extremely important who Biden selects for USDA. I think having new thought, new leadership moving forward would be extremely helpful for the regenerative ag industry, and not folks that have had ties to the input, industry of fertilizers and pesticides. And if we can have some of that kind of innovation of people that have moved that forward, I think we can have tremendous progress moving forward. And one thing I didn't mention in my first comment I meant to is regenerative ag, as everyone probably knows, we don't know the exact science here today, but it can be a huge carbon sink. We're going to have some more data, get some more metrics, and do a lot more testing, but the preliminary data looks very promising. So this is something that we need to do in the long haul for pollution along with climate change.
So Annie, champions, opponents?
First thing I think is needed is strong White House leadership to drive interagency coordination so that USDA, the Department of Defense, the Department of Transportation, EPA, across the agencies, they're working together to bring the different fuels and solutions to bear on the aviation challenge. I note that Representative Brownlee last week introduced a bill that would require aviation to meet targets, set targets for the United States, and also encourage sustainable aviation fuel. So that's an example of a leader I'd look to. Thanks.
Dan?
Great. Well, I think there is a whole government approach around procurement in the bioeconomy that also that applies to algae, that applies to regenerative agriculture, that applies to aviation fuels, and I think that's really important. I would also note that when we're talking about forest products, the U.S. Forest Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, not the Department of Interior, has a tremendously important role to play. As the managers of those lands, as the folks who really understand what's going on the ground, I think revitalizing the capabilities and the authorities in the Forest Service is going to be a really big part of this.
Jill, your thoughts?
Yeah, so we are really lucky because we have an algae caucus in the legislature. It actually exists, and it's actually bipartisan. It seems that led by Representative Scott Peters from San Diego and Representative Darren LaHood from Peoria, Illinois. And that kind of enthusiasm and leadership has really helped us quite a bit. There's also an interagency algae working group, much to what Annie is speaking to, where all the agencies that touch algae, including EPA, USDA, National Science Foundation, and all of them, and DOE, sit together a couple times a year to make sure that's coordinated research and continue to accelerate the commercialization efforts. So I think that's some really exciting role models for some of these other new biomass options and hydrogen.
And Solomon, to close out the lightning round?
Two possible major allies. One is renewable energy producers. There's so much untapped potential, especially in, for instance, Great Plains states with wind and solar. They could be exporting their clean energy if we had the hydrogen production to turn it into a fuel that can be exported around the world. And along similar lines, our military uses a lot of fuel. In particular, hydrogen and ammonia are the likely candidates for maritime fuel. And using executive authority to mandate a procurement of hydrogen and ammonia and other fuels for military procurement could be really useful in creating that initial early market.
So it's interesting, everyone chose to look for the proponents rather than opponents. But on that note, we can all imagine names of opponents. Thank you very much for your work producing the papers, your thoughts, and joining us this evening. Nidhi?
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Adam. And thanks to all of our panelists for that deep dive into innovative fuels and a rural energy economy, and for sharing more thoughts about really how policy is a critical lever for innovation, and how it's critical that we need better leadership at the federal level, both in the White House and at the agencies, and the need for interagency work, and how important all of those pieces are to securing the kind of investment you need to advance these technologies and bringing down the cost curve. And the reminder that, frequently commercial lenders are often unwilling or unable to take on risk for supporting the deployment of a new technology until they've seen a solid history of commercial operation. And it reminded me of some of the work we did at the Loan Programs Office at the Department of Energy in bringing down the costs for PV solar. And I always like to share the factoid that in 2009, there wasn't a single PV solar facility larger than 100 megawatts operating in the US. And the Loan Programs Office at DOE stepped in to fill that valley of death that Adam was talking about. And really launched utility scale PV in the country. They addressed a market barrier and provided more than $4.6 billion in loan guarantees to support the construction of the first 5 commercial PV solar facilities. And I think that is, sort of proof in the pudding at what these kind of federal mechanisms can do and how they can be deployed in the context of the issues our last panelists raised. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce Ken Alston, who's going to be the moderator for our second panel here. Our second panel is going to feature a discussion on innovative energy access. Ken Alston is a fellow co-chair of Clean Energy for Biden, as well as a climate tech investor with 10 years of experience in the public and private sectors. His experience includes working in the Obama-Biden administration at the White House and the U.S. Department of Energy, leading financing programs at New Energy Nexus and CalSub Ventures. And he is also a board member of Revolve and Clean Energy Works. He holds an MBA and MS from Stanford University and a BA from the University of Virginia. And with that, Ken, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nidhi, for that introduction. That was very kind of you to go through the bio, and I'm really pleased to be the moderator for our second panel today on innovative energy access. Today we'll have 5 panelists who will discuss how to break down some of the barriers that we currently face in taking to scale innovative climate technologies. These 5 panelists include Levi Patterson, who will discuss supporting energy commercialization, supporting clean energy commercialization. Jeff Shub will discuss the National Climate Bank proposal. Varun Sivaram will discuss triple federal funding for clean energy innovation, his proposal. Jetta Wong, who will discuss the DOE Foundation. And then Claire Wu will discuss unlocking demand, valuing distributed energy resources in demand response. So before we get into our panel discussion, we have a series of short videos, and let's go ahead and hear those.
Hi, I'm Varun Sivaram. In this paper, I write about launching a national energy innovation mission. Look, in a time of divided government, innovation is probably the one climate priority that we can get legislative approval and bipartisan support behind. In a new book, Energizing America, I, along with my co-authors Colin Cunliffe, David Hart, Julio Friedman, and David Sandalo, urge the U.S. federal government to triple federal research, development, and demonstration funding to $25 billion by 2025. We lay out 10 technology pillars in this paper and in our book, along with strategic principles for the government and a 100-day action plan for the Biden administration to convene a White House task force and coordinate the first budget that will raise budgets by 30% in FY22. This is the best way for the U.S. to maximize its competitive edge in clean energy industries of the future and to combat climate change with the technologies we're going to need. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Jetta Wong. In June, the International Energy Agency reported that 6 of the 46 technologies needed to address climate change are on track. The United States' strong position at the front end of the innovation cycle gives it the ability to capture a substantial share of the trillions of dollars that will flow into the development of these new technologies. Yet, the United States struggles to move innovative energy technologies from discovery to scale. The Biden-Harris administration should move quickly to support the creation of a nonprofit Department of Energy foundation. The foundation will have the goal to accelerate the commercialization of new energy technologies through strategic public-private collaborations. It draws on precedents set by a diverse array of congressionally authorized foundations established over the last 50 years. These independent foundations help create partnerships and leverage private sector follow-on funding to address broad societal challenges. A bipartisan, bicameral provision to establish this foundation passed the House in this fall's energy package and now awaits Senate action.
President-elect Biden should fund the National Climate Bank as part of his stimulus proposal. The nonprofit, also known as the Clean Energy Accelerator, will use the Green Bank model to create millions of jobs, generate 3 times private sector leverage, and invest 40% of funds in disadvantaged communities. It will invest in clean energy infrastructure projects of all kinds, working with state and local green banks and communities across the U.S. Green banks have already driven $5 billion of investment, proving the model works. The bill to fund the nonprofit accelerator was introduced by Senators Markey and Van Hollen with co-sponsorship by Vice President-elect Harris. Representative Dingell's House bill passed the House twice in 2020. This is supported by all major environmental groups and many industry associations. Nearly 100 organizations signed a letter of support, and 7 in 10 voters support the policy. Creation of a national green bank was also proposed by Governor Inslee, Senator Warren, and Mayor Buttigieg as presidential candidates. This is a practical implementation tool to create millions of jobs, support struggling communities and businesses, and spark a rapid and just transition.
Hi, I'm Levi Wyatt Patterson. Clean energy technologies face a number of unique barriers to commercialization, including high upfront capital costs, long development times, and technology transfer at DOE through the Office of Technology Transitions. DOE should expand the mission of and increase funding for OTT to unlock significant economic growth and create employment opportunities by investing in our entrepreneurs and the startups they create. DOE should also direct more funding to entrepreneurs that come from underrepresented backgrounds. Secondly, the DOE should create a new program to invest in regional clean energy innovation ecosystems. From 2005 to 2017, 5 metro areas accounted for more than 90% of the nation's innovation sector growth, while about 90% of metro areas lost jobs in innovation, leading to growing wealth inequality, deepening racial and socioeconomic inequity, and trapping parts of the nation in patterns of underdevelopment. We can reverse these trends by empowering our communities to solve our nation's most challenging clean energy problems. Legislation to do just that was introduced by Representative Eddie Bernice Johnson and passed the House of Representatives in September of this year. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Claire Wu. Our paper is about distributed energy resources and demand response technologies, which include solar PV, energy storage, EV charging, smart loads, etc. These technologies are a key part of the clean energy transition. But they often require large upfront investment, which is a barrier to low-income communities. So our first recommendation is to ensure broad and equitable access by reducing the cost of capital. One model is to use the National Climate Bank, a nonprofit financial institution, to fund regional projects in frontline communities. Our second recommendation is to modernize wholesale markets to ensure that DERs and DR have fair market access and compensation. It will also be hugely beneficial to expand wholesale market access to all areas of the country. Our third recommendation is to create national standards and requirements for DER interconnection and permitting, which will avoid delays and reduce costs for all projects. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for these wonderful videos and the work that you put in terms of developing these policy papers. It's truly an impressive body of work that each of you on this panel have already put forward. So for our conversation today, I want to make this, I really want this to be a conversation amongst the panel. You've done great work. There's a lot of there are areas of overlap and areas of difference between the papers. And it'd be great to hear more in terms of areas where there areas that you distinguish each of your work. So, just to kick things off, I want to start with a pretty broad question, which a number of these papers touched on, which is the challenges of financing clean energy innovation. This is really a topic that is near and dear to my heart from the time that I spent at the U.S. Department of Energy. Really great to see the work that you all put in thinking about this topic. Why don't we start out by just talking about what are some of the broad challenges that exist in financing clean energy innovation, and maybe talk about how your proposal is setting out to tackle this. So I guess I can cold call Varun. Would you like to kick us off?
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much, Ken, and great job to you and all the other CE4B co-chairs. Thrilled to be here. Look, we all know that financing clean energy is fraught with danger and difficulty. We saw the Clean Tech 1.0 boom and bust, and there's a great article today in MIT Tech Review on lessons learned and why right now we may be in a Clean Tech 2.0 boom, which we hope doesn't turn into a bust. But as you know, strong incumbents, entrenched infrastructure, strong regulations, and the long timelines and high capital intensity of clean energy technologies make it tough to invest and deliver returns in the private sector. And that's where government financing comes in. You know, if I think about the biggest challenge that financing clean energy innovation faces, it's actually not that it's unpopular, it's broadly popular. The problem is that folks are kind of lukewarm about it. You know, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Of course, we like innovation. But I think right now we're in a very special political moment. Look, first of all, we've just seen 2 vaccines produce remarkable results thanks to a health innovation mission. We just saw SpaceX launch the Commercial Crew Program thanks to the National Space Innovation Mission. A National Energy Innovation Mission couldn't be more popular right now. And under divided government, it's probably one of the only high ambition priorities that we can really get through government. So I think this is a rare political moment to really increase government funding and provide kind of that long-term sustainable, smooth funding across the innovation pipeline to balance out a lot of the fluctuations we see in private markets and avoid what could be a clean tech 2.0 bubble.
So Ken, I'll jump in here. I completely agree with Varun. We obviously need more investment from the federal government, but I think the other really important thing that we have to think about, and I think the article earlier today that Varun was talking about pointed out, is that we are starting to see some funding come in, especially in the early stage space. But one of the major problems when it comes to funding or to any of the challenges of getting through that valley of death that the first panel talked about was the fact that we are a very disconnected innovation ecosystem across the country. Most of the time, the early stage startups and the scientists don't actually know what their customers need. You know, they don't actually talk to their utilities or their eventual customer. And so we need to find ways to bridge that gap. And that's done through what we're talking about is the Department of Energy Foundation, which will help fund incubators and organizations across the country in regions like what Levi is going to talk about to really help people on the ground find the right resources, both financing and technical expertise to get through that valley of death. It's really about connecting all of those partners together.
And just adding to that, sorry, I really agree, and I think during the whole campaign, I think there was a lot more attention paid to the full life cycle of needs for financing innovative tech, all the way from early in the lab to the deployment end of the spectrum, which has tended to be overlooked from federal financing perspective, specifically looking at solutions that need to be brought to scale that typically wouldn't qualify for things like the DOE Loan Program Office, but are not penetrating the market at a meaningful level. Meaningful meaning 20, 30, 40, 50% market penetration, which we need to get to. And that's really where sort of green banks and the National Climate Bank come in. It's thinking about how do we build a bridge that carries those newer technologies, not just through pilot and first and second and third commercial deployment, but all the way to scale deployment. And having that sort of pull all the way at the end of the technology development spectrum has a really important impact, because you know that you're not just building a pier out into the middle of the ocean, you're building a bridge to a larger market penetration. There are innovative business models that need to be created to make that work. For example, we know perfectly well that there are plenty of financial and business models that can serve residential rooftop solar market if you happen to have a roof facing the right direction and a FICO score above a certain level. But if you don't have that, then we need financial market and business model innovation to serve those ends of the market. And that's how you actually get deeper market penetration. So I think there's opportunities for financial innovation all the way through the technology spectrum.
Claire, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so I think, I agree with all the other speakers in terms of how to use these innovation, different recommendations to lower the cost of capital, and all of this are going to be really beneficial to the DER industry, which is the topic that is near and dear to this paper that I'm presenting today. But I wanted to also mention a parallel barrier that, in addition to just getting the financing, is one of the other biggest barrier to just DER deployment in general is regulatory. It's these outdated market rules that were designed for an older incumbent sort of technologies, basically large fossil fuel power plants. And many you have maybe heard of the recent FERC Order 2222 that came out in September that was really considered a landmark decision because it opened up wholesale market access to DERs. So that in theory, small resources like water heaters, smart thermostats, or batteries in your home can soon be aggregated to participate in wholesale markets as equals to these large power plants. But, and I'm going to get a little bit wonky here because there are a lot of details that have yet to be worked out in terms of how this Order 2222 will be implemented in all the ISOs and RTOs, these wholesale markets. Things like participation models, telemetry, rules for hybrid resources, availability requirements, interconnection, jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera. And the challenge is that some ISOs might implement rules that in theory make market access doable, but in practice, in reality, really still make it hard for DERs to participate on an equal footing. And so we really need FERC to be diligent in enforcing this Order 2222, and we need stakeholder input from the DER industry, especially from companies that have more innovative business models, to make sure that the implementation of this rule is really effective.
Yeah, thank you, Claire, and thanks for touching on. There's clearly a range of issues beyond just the financing, but on its own, there the regulatory framework also plays an important role. Just touching on this financing question again and access to financing, I just want to ask Levi. You took a slightly different approach than some of the other paper authors in terms of thinking about a regional approach to financing to implement financing. And so maybe just touch on that. What drove your approach and how it's maybe a little bit differentiated.
And I did the mute thing. All right, I think it's mostly so there's two things. Is one, if we were looking at just purely the financing side of it, if we definitely need to increase how much we finance and how we finance, and we need a lot of innovations in that part. But we can also invest in our regions and create clean energy innovation ecosystems. So when we ramp up our financing, that financing is used more effectively and has a higher chance of success. So investing in local communities to be able to create their own robust energy innovation ecosystems, once a successful technology is funded in a region, their newer ideas and better ideas are much more likely to get financed. So that's one part about how regional innovation ecosystems fit in with the financing side, is they'll make it more successful. The second part is when the federal government uses taxpayer dollars to invest in clean energy innovation, we need to make sure that it is making people's lives better. So providing support to local communities to make sure that they have workforce, that they have expertise, that they have support to their universities, to their community colleges, in order to support and really leverage our clean energy innovation investments. We'll make sure that when we ramp up our clean energy innovation funding, that it's making people's lives better, creating jobs, and build support for the idea.
Excellent. And if there's anyone who would like to build on this a little bit, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think the regional and sort of state and local based approach is so important. I mean, I don't think I don't think there's any commodity in the United States that's as purely identical as an electron, but differs in price as much as electricity does across the US. I mean, you can't solve this at a national level. We need to be thinking about it at state and local level solutions. It doesn't mean that the financing mechanisms or the kind of a regional approach that Levi is talking about can't be replicated and applied across the country, but it does mean that we need to have regional, state, and local actors have a lot of control over how those ecosystems develop and the kinds of investment and the kinds of energy solutions that are being deployed, because they do vary across geographies. The kinds of solutions that are going to work in the Southeast are definitely going to be different than in the Northwest. From the climate bank perspective, that means supporting the creation and the funding of state and local green banks all over the country, which certainly should be part and parcel of that kind of innovation regional ecosystem that Levi is talking about.
I think it's also really important to point out that there exists expertise in these regions. And as Jeff was saying, those regions often have specific issues that they're dealing with, especially as it relates to energy. The Northeast is very different than the Southeast. But not all these regions are the same in that they don't always have access to financing, access to great universities and national laboratories, especially when we start talking about disadvantaged communities and communities of color where they haven't had access to these things for forever, basically, and wanting to make sure that regional innovation ecosystems really engage them and bring those people together to understand what those problems are is something that the DOE Foundation would really focus its attention on. Because the whole idea around the DOE Foundation is that it would be authorized by Congress to work with the Department of Energy to bring those resources to those communities that don't have access. And so one thing that I've always heard about the Department of Energy, especially when I worked there, was most people don't know what DOE does. They don't know that DOE has these financing capabilities. They don't know that DOE has access to all these excellent laboratory scientists and unique facilities. And so what we need to do is we need to make it easier for people, all people, to access these facilities in all regions of the country, because not every region is created equally.
So well put, Jetta, and I really like this focus that you have with the DOE Foundation proposal, the emphasis that you put on how this will expand access to parts of the country that may not have previously had a chance to engage with the Department of Energy. You're just touching on this point in terms of access, but also I think this touches on another really important topic, which is equity. And so I wanted to, I was struck, maybe just to kick off discussion around this. I was struck, Claire, that you mentioned in your proposal a specific focus around broad and equitable access to, for frontline communities to DERs and to demand response. Can you touch a little bit more on your recommendation and how you put this recommendation in the broad scope of the paper?
Yeah, so we really, I think if you think about it broadly, DERs have a lot of benefits that are inherently can support sort of equity or equitable access. The first is just, it's fairly well known at this point that communities of color pay higher energy bills, and distributed energy, in general, can help these communities reduce their energy bills and also have them participate in the clean energy transition that previously maybe only wealthier populations can participate in. The second inherent benefit is that DERs help reduce what we call coincident peak demand. And that's important because that can help us accelerate the removal of the highest emitting peaker plants, which are usually located in or built in sort of denser communities of color. And so by helping or promoting the deployment of DERs, we can help remove these high emitting peaker plants faster and therefore benefit communities of color. The third sort of maybe even the most obvious inherent benefit is that the advantages of distributed energy resources over a large centralized generator is the ability of DERs to provide resilience, especially in climate disaster prone areas and rural areas. So, DERs such as microgrids can provide backup power to homes and communities for extended periods of time during grid outages. And these extended backup power, during extreme weather events can be life-saving for vulnerable populations and really is crucial to reduce the economic impacts of these climate events.
And if I'm seeing that we're getting close to the end of our time, but if someone else would want to weigh in there, we have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, the climate bank legislation has a very specific clause requiring, as the version that passed the House twice this year with $20 billion of funding each time, has a specific provision requiring 20% of investment to go into climate impacted communities. That's going to be lifted up to 40% for the next session when it's reintroduced. This is also a key reason why the climate bank is going to be an independent nonprofit. It turns out doing this kind of directed investment within government is technically and legally really challenging. And so having that kind of flexibility to direct investments into small businesses, into communities to support just transition is really a key component that's sort of built into the foundation of the organization itself, both through its investment mandate and through its board and oversight and staffing.
Excellent.
And then I'll quickly say, when it comes to innovation policy, kind of a full pipeline approach to innovation and industrial policy is needed to direct innovation to ensure broad distributionally beneficial outcomes. So if we have a system where we innovate here and then produce there, produce in China, for example, you may lose some of the equity benefits. But a great breakthrough energy report out in September suggests that clean energy innovation funding is actually the most effective job creator at a cost per job year of $15,000. It's the largest indirect multiplier of employment at 2.7 indirect jobs per direct R&D job. And the average compensation across direct and indirect jobs is $77,000 a year, higher than the American average. If you combine it with many of the things we heard from Levi and Claire and Jeffrey and Jetta on regional innovation systems, and you make sure that the innovation benefits aren't concentrated in just a couple coastal cities, but are diffused across the country, you can create industrial clusters where you create jobs across a broad swath of socioeconomic ladder positions. All this is to say, innovation can be the engine of American growth, and it can be the engine across not only high-paying sectors, but also a broad swath of the American economy. And here we are, we're probably in the 5th panel of the CE4B summits, and innovation is kind of nestled in there. This is the #1 thing we can do for ambitious climate policy right now and for equity.
Great. Well, thanks so much to each of you. I wish we had more time. We're going to have to leave things there, but thank you, and encourage everyone to go out and read these papers, and we'll further the conversation there. Thanks. Back to you, Nidhi.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks to all of our distinguished panelists for that solution-oriented discussion on innovation and energy access and financing mechanisms that can help bridge the spectrum for energy technology development. And really importantly, for highlighting how certain financing mechanisms can lead to better equity. A very good reminder of Congresswoman Helen's remarks on how innovation can be a pathway for environmental and economic injustice. So I just wanted to provide the audience a reminder that if you have any questions for our panelists, please do post them in the chat, and our panelists will follow up with you separately. And with that, I wanted to go ahead and introduce our final panel tonight. And this is unfortunately also the last panel of our Policy Summit series. Our final panel tonight will feature a discussion on innovative technologies and data access. Our panel will be moderated by Dr. Alice Grossman. Dr. Grossman is an expert in data and performance measurement and is a Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, working with social scientists to further the use of social data for portfolio analysis in the federal government. Dr. Grossman completed her PhD in Transportation Systems Engineering and has worked with the Pritzker Award-winning Catalan architecture firm RCR Architects, as well as the South Pole Telescope Group at the University of Chicago. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Grossman to introduce our last panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nidhi. So we are speaking here in our last panel. It's going to be a good one, so bear with us. And I have joining me today 4 experts, Dr. Jessica Lovering, who specializes in advanced nuclear and the decarbonization of the global economy, as well as Nathaniel Horadam, who is a transportation professional with a focus on connected, automated, and electric vehicles and public transit. Nicholas Eisenberger, who is a clean energy and technology expert with extensive experience in direct air capture. And Bob King, who is one of the global leading experts in utility, health, grid, and consumer data. So we're gonna turn it over to a short video with them discussing their recommendations, and then we will move on to discussion.
Nuclear is currently the largest source of clean energy in the US, but it is also the technology with the most barriers to commercialization and deployment. Advancements in nuclear technology address waste, cost, and safety, but will need policy support to ensure they are deployed in an equitable and sustainable way. To make nuclear cheap and competitive, we will need a whole-of-government approach that establishes staff positions across the administration, reestablishes the U.S. government as the first funder and customer of domestic advanced nuclear technologies, and modernizes the licensing process. We'll also need to recognize nuclear as clean energy and regain global leadership in exports through a significant investment in innovation, valuing the low-carbon contributions of nuclear in energy market pricing, and including advanced nuclear as part of a Green Marshall Plan for climate. Finally, we should establish a social science agenda for nuclear with the goal of achieving more equitable adoption and to secure environmental justice. A good place to start is by developing a coal to nuclear repowering program and implementing a review of the national fuel cycle strategy with a focus on equity.
Transit innovation has been growing as a U.S. policy concern due to competitive pressures from ride-hailing firms, strained local finances, and emphasis on reducing both emissions and racial inequality in our transportation system. Investing in transit innovation has long been a federal responsibility, but we currently spend only about $30 million annually on these programs versus nearly $15 billion for transit rolling stock and other capital programs. Our recommendations focus on 3 key ideas, which will increase transit's competitiveness, support decarbonization, create good-paying American jobs, and deliver more equitable mobility outcomes. Number 1, increase authorized funding for Section 5312, which covers transit research and innovation programming, to $100 million annually. Number 2, create incentives in other U.S. DOT innovation programs to incorporate transit through selection criteria. Number 3, as we currently don't have one, support the creation of a domestic railcar manufacturer by helping local transit agencies pool resources to fund the creation of one.
Hi, my name is Abigail Rajitsky, and I'm here to talk about direct air capture, or DAC. DAC technology will be essential to achieve the Biden climate goal of net zero emissions by 2050 and for the entire world to limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees C. The United States can be the global leader in the development, manufacturing, and deployment of DAC technologies, which can create a whole new U.S. industry with the potential for more than 1.35 million high-quality, good-paying jobs. Plus, the benefits of a robust DAC-enabled circular carbon economy can be more equitably distributed, while mitigating the negative impacts of the fossil economy on frontline communities. To build a U.S. DAC industry, we recommend the Biden administration provide direct financial support for and enable financing for first-of-a-kind DAC projects, establish a coordinated cross-agency federal RD&D carbon removal and storage strategy, and leverage federal procurement and standards to create markets for DAC services and products. My co-author, Nicholas Eisenberger, will join you for the panel.
Tapping the energy and flexibility of distributed resources to meet our climate and job creation goals requires access to data held by utilities. The Obama-Biden administration helped us launch Green Button Connect My Data as a data sharing industry standard. But our non-standard implementation has become another barrier to data access and to innovation. It limits customer choice and the value of distributed resources themselves. The market response is creating new data security problems and cutting utilities out of the data flow. A unified national system for secure data sharing, like the ATM system in banking, would unleash private sector innovation and benefit consumers and utilities alike. The House-passed e-access bill provides a vehicle to reboot the national effort. Failing legislation, recovery funds could be made contingent upon state or utility participation in a solution.
Great, thank you, Charlie. So one of the themes that we've been speaking about, not just in this panel, but also all night and over the 3 policy summits that we've had this month, is funding and financing. So when we think of innovation, there's often, a funding boost that we need towards the beginning to get new technologies off the ground and to try to find economies of scale. So all of you do recommend that we increase either funding through government agencies or at least some oversight responsibilities at government agencies. And so I'm wondering, without getting into reappropriating money from other sectors or areas, can you talk a little bit about if there are ways that we can think about moving funds within DOE, within FERC, within DOT to try to fund or finance some of the solutions that you spoke about? We'll start with Nathaniel.
Thanks, Alice. Take it from the highways. So right now, basically transit innovation is funded through 3 sources. One is direct, as you saw on our slide earlier. It's direct funding through FTA. It's about $30 million a year. And while we think that should be expanded, there are also existing authorized programs across US DOT and also the Vehicle Technologies Office in the Department of Energy that without any sort of legislative changes, you can steer additional funding. And part of that may just be by putting climate-oriented criteria into these programs, but a lot of it will just be, $60 million for the ATC MTD program. All right, well, some of that's got to go to transit now. It can't all fund highway expansion or connected vehicle projects for light vehicles or trucks or something like that. So there are really easy, quick and dirty ways to do this, to put transit where, otherwise it's not going to get the funding. The private sector is not stepping in. The US transit market isn't large enough. It's not Europe, it's not China, it's not Japan, to where that funding is going to come naturally. So, that's where the government should step in. The federal government, as I noted earlier, has traditionally held that responsibility. I think, Alice, you wanted to go to Jessica next, right?
Great, yeah.
Thanks, Nathaniel. So, we do call for doubling the budget of the Office of Nuclear Energy to start, but within nuclear energy, I think there could be a much better sort of refocusing or reprioritization on what R&D is funded, particularly a move away from basic R&D to deployment and demonstration funding. So, we've got a lot of advanced nuclear technologies kind of close to commercialization. So looking more at innovations and R&D that bring costs down, improve performance, and actually get these things demonstrated would be really important. And the other thing to keep in mind with nuclear is that there is a lot of private investment going in. So thinking about how to leverage that better. So one way to do that is to use more federal money to invest in infrastructure that supports and stimulates the private sector for nuclear. So things like testing and experimental facilities that private companies can use to help them commercialize and prove the concept for their technologies.
Great, let's go over to Nicholas.
Thanks. So, as you know, direct air capture is a key enabling technology to both address climate change at scale and to help transform our current fossil-based carbon economy to an air-based carbon economy. And the good news there is that not only creates economic value that the private sector, in addition to the public sector, can help to realize and fund, but it means that you can take advantage of the existing national and international infrastructure around fossil and other major industries. We're still using carbon. It's still a foundation of our economy. You do not have to leave aside these existing industries, jobs, and also government programs because we're still using carbon just based on air, excuse me. I guess I would say that, of course, that kind of transformation will involve significant change over time in government policies and programs, many of which we've recommended in this paper. But to me, I haven't put a lot of thought into, where we should take funding from and put it to. I guess one thing that does stand out in the conversation around carbon capture is conventionally we thought we need to build pipelines to move CO2 around. Maybe some of that will be needed, but with direct air capture, you can site it anywhere where it's needed. And that really means the air is your infrastructure. And so there are things like pipelines and other things like that where direct air capture does open up new possibilities that might be a little bit more difficult previously.
So I can jump in for a second too. It was actually the White House last time Biden was in office that challenged the industry to come up with a data sharing solution. Standard, which is now a standard of NASB, the North American Energy Standards Board, but leadership was provided by the Department of Energy and NIST in developing that. And we just sort of dropped the ball at the end of that period. And for 4 years, most of the work is going on in individual states, and state leadership has been helpful, but it's part of what's creating kind of a patchwork of data solutions rather than a single unified national platform. So some kind of leadership from DOE would be really important, and that's what the E-Access bill addresses. Also, you have the EIA has authority under Section 861 to collect data from utilities. And if they simply made tariff data available in machine readable format, that would save a huge amount of money for third parties trying to develop things. Claire Wu did a great job of talking about the potential benefits of distributed energy resources, but without access to data about consumption and tariffs and capacity, these things just simply will never reach their full capacity, or we won't be able to leverage them the way she described.
Great. So staying vaguely on that topic, I thought it was interesting. Jessica noted that maybe there's actually less funding we need for R&D now that we've got these sort of tried and true mechanisms to produce clean energy that we're just not ramping up the actual implementation of. And Bob, you mentioned also, we've got the data, but we need to think about putting it in a different format, which can also be time and cost intensive, of course, doing an entire rollover with that. So what exactly are the costs? And you don't have to give a dollar amount, but what would the differential in costs be in these solutions? And going back to the equity perspective that we touched on in the last panel, how can we make sure that these costs are not transferred onto the consumer? And especially in cases like with yours, Nathaniel, public transit is generally a household cost that has an impact greater on low-income families. Generally, energy consumption as well. We want to be thinking about the lower income sector of the population in this country. So how do we move forward with implementation and funding, both from the public and private sector, to make sure that we are able to maintain that equity in the consumer cost?
Well, if I can hop in, I think just to point out that the advanced reactor companies that are working towards commercialization are aiming to be cost competitive with natural gas eventually with their nth of a kind reactors. The first of a kind might be more expensive, and so that's where they would need help, whether it's public-private partnerships or cost sharing with the government for their first few builds. And that's why in our memo, we call for the federal government being the first customer of these to do procurement for federal sites. That could be a good way to help bring these costs down, because a lot of these designs are either modular or fully factory fabricated. We would expect costs to come down with serial production. So getting those orders logged is really important. And I think the federal government can have a big role in there, because they're already paying a lot for electricity all over the place. So having a mandate that a certain amount comes from clean energy that includes nuclear could be really important.
I guess I'll jump in quickly on the cost factor. First of all, a lot of people originally perceived that direct air capture was inherently more expensive because it's a you're trying to capture CO2 from air in a dilute form versus flue gas capture. Anybody who's really looked at it now sees that cost is not going to be a factor. We're already well below in terms of cost reduction, cost curve rates than solar was, where it's achieved now. We only have several X's to go versus many X's that solar had when it started, and direct air capture is just getting started. So we're going to get there well below $100 a ton very quickly, and some people think well below half of that. So I think we have to remove cost as a factor. We can solve the entire, essentially, climate change problem for several $1 trillion. We've already spent as a globe $12 trillion in the first 6 months of the pandemic. So that's really ultimately a cost that society can bear to address the mortal threat of climate change. On the equity front, also, just very quickly, incredibly important. Direct air capture has the advantage. Air is everywhere, and every person and every community and every country and every society can participate in addressing climate change and moving to a circular carbon economy in a much more equitable fashion than the concentrated fossil resources have forced us to have today. And it also obviously lessens the pollution and contamination over time of a fossil-based economy. So from an equity perspective, direct air capture, I think, has the sort of the structural benefits of relying on something that is really free and available to everyone.
You know, and also when you were speaking, Nicholas, occurred to me that most of the communities that are most affected by poor air quality are low-income neighborhoods and areas where people of color live. So if we can is there a way we could prioritize where we're using these technologies? Is the efficiency different in different places depending on the concentration of particulate matters?
No, not at all. But you can say, if you think about the vision of taking CO2 from air and turning it into fuel and polymers and chemicals and soil and food and building materials, you can think about how you could focus development, economic development in areas that can produce those things that society needs, whether you're talking a frontline community here in the United States or anywhere around the world where they need these kinds of materials for basic human needs. And so you can lens those in those places proactively.
Got it.
Alice, if I can jump in real quick. With transit, there's this double standard, right? I mean, a state DOT has billions of dollars a year they pump into various capital projects. And if they squirrel away, $20-30 million here and there for, innovative type projects, nobody notices it. But every single transit dollar spent is heavily scrutinized. And you've seen it with all these pilot projects, looking at microtransit, looking at new BRT routes. And so that's where federal funding truly matters, because it's an 80-20 or even a 100% to zero federal to local split in funding. It just makes such a big difference to be able to have that and not force localities to not only bear the cost of we're already very scarce transit dollars, but also the scrutiny that comes with trying to do new and innovative things.
As a transportation person, I completely agree with you there, Nathaniel. We've got 20 more seconds, so I'm going to turn it over to Bob for the last 20 seconds.
Oh, gosh, thanks. Well, I just want to say that particularly on creating new innovation on distributed resources like managing energy and integrating various systems and so on the edge of the grid, money is walking away from this. And what customers are getting, therefore, is a very limited set of choices. I've heard utilities say, well, gee, I guess there's not much innovation out there. But look at a single platform like Apple, and you allow innovation to reach billions of customers on a single platform, you get millions of apps. We don't do that. Every utility has its own, and only some of the utilities, in fact, have done anything. So
yeah, and just to wrap it up from the equity perspective, Bob, is there an equity lens we can be looking at here, just real quick?
Is there an equity what?
Lens.
Well, I'm saying money is walking away. If we could create a single uniform system to access data that's available from smart grid, smart meters, and so on, innovation will flood back into the market. But I've been involved with several companies in the space that have pivoted to other industries or have just become utility offerings, and customers get the MRE kind of version of smart grid offerings from their local utility, but not the rich selection of choices that they would have if we simply open this up.
All right, thanks. So thank you all very much. This was a really good, quick information, and back to you, Nidhi.
Okay. Well, thanks for that really fantastic discussion on some innovative technologies that could help advance a cleaner and more equitable future. So although our panels have wrapped up, we are not actually done our program yet. So please stay with me. I see Trenton Allen has joined us. Hi, Trenton. Trenton's going to be providing us some closing remarks to help wrap up our Policy Summit series here. Trenton is the Managing Director and CEO of Sustainable Capital Advisors and is an experienced energy and banking professional with nearly 20 years of experience and $18 billion in transaction experience. He has financed a wide range of infrastructure projects, from water, wastewater, energy efficiency, renewable energy, fossil projects, all for a variety of clients from business and governmental sectors. Trenton is also an executive council member for Clean Energy for Biden and a frequent speaker at major energy conferences, as well as very widely regarded as a thought leader in the financing of clean energy projects. Mr. Allen is passionate about energy security and creating solutions that provide energy access to underserved communities around the world. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Trenton.
Thank you, Nidhi. And thank you to all on the Clean Energy for Biden Executive Board and other executive committee members. It's been a pleasure working with you all over the last 7 or 8 months, and I understand it's been a whole lot of work, but I'm glad that we're at this particular juncture with a particular outcome with President-elect Biden. Tonight, we've had the opportunity, and not just tonight, but over the course of the past few weeks, to hear many of the policy recommendations that are bubbled up from members in the clean energy community. And one of the things tonight that I enjoyed hearing about was really sort of the information from many of the thought leaders across the country around the areas of innovation, particularly in fuels and rural economy, affordable and equitable access and data, with topics ranging from clean hydrogen production to regenerative agriculture to value and distributed energy resources to equitable consumer data access and creation of a national climate bank. You can imagine that in the area of finance or talking about the National Climate Bank gets me excited, but really the idea about how finance is key to a lot of what we want to do with regards to innovation when it comes to meeting the challenge of climate change and also building back our economy in a much stronger way than it was prior to the COVID pandemic. And we know that from the vision that's been laid out by President-elect Biden, that innovation is at the heart of the Build Back Better. And there's so many opportunities that exist when we think about innovation in the energy sector. And so having the list of and the policy recommendations that have come forth is incredibly exciting. And I look forward to even reaching out to many of you all to figure out sort of how we can think about finance in that particular space. And when we think about innovation, we all know that innovation is a drought creator, but in some respects it is also, it really is out there to solve a problem. As we persevere through this COVID pandemic, we understand that clean energy innovation will be a critical component of our COVID recovery. And supporting innovation will allow us to empower communities who have been worse impacted, not only from COVID, but also from from our usage of fossil fuels throughout this country and all the world. And so innovation also has the opportunity to return the U.S. to a place of international leadership and competitiveness, and not only just in employment and growth, but also reduction of greenhouse gases. And so when we think about innovation, we also recognize that it's not tied to just technology, that there's been a whole lot of discussion around different business models, finance solutions, and policy solutions that are at the core of what innovation is and what we will need to really meet the opportunities, to meet our opportunity with regards to really building back better. And so Dr. Martin laid out something this, at the beginning of our discussion, talked about innovation really isn't always new. That's my words, paraphrasing. And I think about what I do on the finance side. Is really people ask, you work a lot in financial innovation. I say yes, but basically what we're doing is much more like a chef. We're taking known ingredients and just creating a new recipe. I'm not creating any new ingredients. We're just using it in a slightly different way. And I think a lot of times we have an opportunity to think about other ways to transfer knowledge that we have from other areas and combine it in new policies or new platforms to really reach the end goal that we like. And so when we think about, as we close and start thinking about where we go from here, I think about the Build Back Better as an opportunity for us to open up our eyes and see the possibilities anew. And so 3 things that we can do is 1, stay connected with each other, expand the community of stakeholders who are invested in a clean and resilient future, where we can search for common ground and find allied solutions. Secondly, we can push each other within our ecosystem, but also push policymakers and push policies and regulations that have an ability to allow for these new technologies to be adopted, for new funding to be provided, and new opportunities that can be created for all. And lastly, I say we need to be intentional, especially when we think about equity. Nothing happens by chance. When we think about sort of how we create something and work that we've done in the past, we've created solutions that have expanded access to community solar projects, particularly for low-income customers, because we designed it that way. We didn't just hope that we create a market solution and it would occur. And so I think when we think about being intentional with regards to equity and inclusion, one of the things we need to make sure is that we also understand, how do we have enough capital? Who's participating in the projects? Where does the benefit, in which communities can we have access to? And then lastly, can we create and broaden out those who are participating and benefiting in the financing and the financial benefits of these particular projects as well? And so I believe that there is a wonderful opportunity here for us all to participate. And I look forward to joining you all and reach out with you all as we continue to grow and build back better.
Thank you, Trenton. Thanks for those remarks and for reminding us that even small tweaks to the ingredients of innovation can yield really different and bold and big results. And for the need for being intentional about equity and inclusion, and the need for so many of us here to collaborate and really come together on finding solutions that can help us build back better. So I also want to say a thank you again to Congresswoman Haaland and Dr. Martin for joining us earlier today, and to all of our distinguished panelists and moderators. And a big thank you to all of our participants who joined us tonight and for our prior policy summits. And I'd like to provide a couple of more items here just as a reminder. Clean Energy for Biden has a Georgia fundraiser coming up to help in that really critical Senate race. It's going to be for both Warnock and Ossoff. It's December 9th, 8 p.m. Eastern. You can find information for that fundraiser on Clean Energy for Biden's website, as well as I think it's being posted in the chat, a link for the fundraiser. This is an incredibly critical race that really could define how much work in progress we get done in the next 2 years. So please, please, please dig deep. I know you're probably financially exhausted at this point. Anything you can contribute helps. I'd also like to remind everyone that Clean Energy for Biden completed its real critical task of electing the Biden-Harris ticket, but our work is not done. And we've built this amazing community, and we look forward to figuring out what the next chapter of CE4B looks like. So please fill out the survey that we've been circulating. We really want member input on that. And then finally, last but unfortunately, it is actually last. I would be remiss if I didn't thank the folks who have really pulled just countless hours putting this event together, as well as the other two policy summits. So I'd really like to thank Elliot Roseman, Barbara Tieran, Kevin Carroll, Marshall Dor Balkind, Charlie Pilzer, Jacob Eder, Will Riker, and my fellow co-chairs Alex McDonough and Nicole Steele for spearheading the planning and coordination of all three of these policy summits. This has just been an absolutely incredible event, and I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for all of your work, and thanks for joining us tonight. And with that, we will conclude our final policy summit. Thank you.